There are moments in history that arrive dressed in the absurd, wearing costumes so unlikely that if you encountered them in fiction, you would dismiss them as too convenient, too perfect in their irony. This is one of those moments, and it unfolds not on a battlefield where armies clash in thunder and fire, but in a prisoner-of-war camp somewhere in the flat expanse of Texas, under a sky so wide it seems to mock the very concept of confinement. The year is 1943, and the world is tearing itself apart with an enthusiasm that would be remarkable if it were not so horrifying. But here, in this particular corner of that global conflagration, something strange is happening, something that begins with laughter. The prisoners have arrived from North Africa, carried across an ocean to a land so foreign it might as well be another planet. They are soldiers of the Reich, men who marched through Poland and France with the confidence of those who believed themselves chosen by history itself. Their uniforms, though dusty and worn from the desert campaign, still carry the ghost of that confidence. They stand by the fence, these men, and they are laughing. Not the bitter laughter of the defeated, not yet, but something closer to genuine amusement tinged with disbelief. The object of their mirth sits in crates before them, distributed by guards who seem entirely unaware that they are handing out comedy material. Shoes, American Army shoes. And to eyes trained in the Prussian tradition of military excellence, these shoes are nothing short of hilarious. Imagine what they saw. Broad things, flat and ungainly, constructed from leather that looked thick and unrefined. The soles were rubber, heavy rubber, the kind of material you might expect on work boots for labourers, not on the feet of professional soldiers. There was no elegance to them, no sleek lines, no craftsmanship that spoke of martial tradition. They looked, and this is what the prisoners whispered to one another with growing delight, like something a farmer would wear, like clogs, like the footwear of men who worked soil, not men who conquered nations. One prisoner, a corporal whose name has been lost to time but whose words were remembered, leaned close to his comrades and spoke with a voice dripping in mockery. "This is what defeated us," he said, and the others dissolved into fresh waves of laughter. The absurdity was too perfect. Here they were, soldiers of an army that prided itself on precision and quality, captured by men who apparently could not even produce decent boots. The German soldiers knew their own equipment well. They had marched in boots that rose nearly to the knee, polished leather that gleamed even in desert sand, soles reinforced with iron hobnails that rang out on pavement like declarations of purpose. These boots were not merely functional items, they were symbols. They represented a military tradition that stretched back centuries, to the days when Prussian discipline was synonymous with military excellence. Officers had always insisted that equipment mattered, that quality was a reflection of the army's soul. And now here were their captors, offering them footwear that looked like it had been designed by committee, produced in haste, thrown together without thought for appearance or tradition. The contrast was so stark, it seemed to confirm everything the prisoners believed about American culture: crude, utilitarian, lacking in refinement, an army of shopkeepers and farmers playing at war. But time has a way of eroding certainty, and in this case it would not take long. Within days, perhaps a week at most, the prisoners were being organized into work details. The Geneva Convention stipulated certain things about the treatment of prisoners, and labor was permitted under specific conditions. The men would work outside the camp, supervised but engaged in productive activity. And for this work, they would need proper footwear. The camp administration, with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized American military logistics, issued them the shoes they had mocked. "Put these on," the guards said, and the prisoners complied, though many did so with smirks still playing at the corners of their mouths. They laced up the broad, flat, ridiculous-looking American shoes and prepared themselves for what they assumed would be an uncomfortable validation of their initial assessment. The first steps were strange. The leather felt different under their hands as they tied the laces, softer somehow, more pliable. The shoes themselves were lighter than expected, noticeably lighter than the tall boots they had worn for years. When they stood, the thick rubber soles created an odd sensation, a kind of cushioning that was unfamiliar. But they said nothing about this, not yet. They simply walked out to their assigned tasks, ready to endure whatever discomfort came, ready to laugh about it later. The Texas sun beat down with an intensity that seemed designed to punish, and the work was not easy. Moving lumber, clearing land, tasks that required hours of standing and walking across terrain that varied from hard-packed earth to loose soil to rocky patches that threatened ankles with every step. And here is where the story pivots, where the laughter begins its slow transformation into something else entirely. By midday, the men wearing their old German boots were struggling. Feet that had seemed fine in the cool of morning were now burning, blisters forming at heel and toe where stiff leather refused to flex properly. Seams that had held through European campaigns were beginning to split under the relentless combination of heat and strain. Men limped, trying to disguise their discomfort, trying to maintain the bearing of professional soldiers even as their feet screamed protest. But those wearing the American shoes moved differently. They still worked, still sweated under that merciless sun, but their steps remained steady. The cushioning that had seemed so odd that morning was now revealing its purpose, absorbing impact, distributing weight in ways that traditional boots never had. The lighter construction meant less energy expended with each step, energy that accumulated over hours into noticeably less fatigue. By evening, when the work details returned to camp, the barracks had taken on a different atmosphere. The laughter was gone. In its place hung a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken realization. Men sat on bunks and removed the shoes carefully, almost reverently, examining them with new eyes. The mockery of yesterday felt distant now, replaced by something more complicated. One prisoner simply stared at the shoes in his hands as if they had somehow betrayed him, as if by being good they had undermined an entire world view. Another was lacing his pair more tightly, his face expressionless, but his actions speaking volumes. He was making sure they fit well, making sure they would be comfortable for tomorrow. The admission hung in the air without being spoken. These ridiculous-looking shoes, these symbols of American crudeness, were better than what they had worn for years. Sleep came hard that night for many of them, because this was not merely about footwear, though it manifested that way. This was about the confrontation between what they had been taught to believe and what they were now experiencing. The Reich had spent years constructing a narrative of superiority. German engineering was the finest in the world. German discipline was unmatched. German equipment was the envy of all nations. These were not merely propaganda points. These were articles of faith, repeated so often they had calcified into unquestionable truth. And yet here was evidence, literally at their feet, that challenged that entire edifice. If the Americans could make better shoes, what else might they be better at? The thought was uncomfortable, almost dangerous, and most of the prisoners shoved it away, unwilling to follow it to its logical conclusion. But it lurked there nonetheless, a seed planted that would only grow with time. The days that followed established a pattern. Each morning the prisoners laced up the American shoes. Each day they worked under guard, performing tasks that required them to be on their feet for hours. And each day the shoes performed flawlessly. No blisters, no splits, no complaints from feet that had known years of marching in traditional boots. The transformation in attitude was gradual but undeniable. Men who had openly mocked now said nothing. Some even began competing quietly to receive newer pairs when supplies arrived, checking the soles for thickness, running hands over leather to assess quality. What had been an object of derision was becoming something desired, and the irony of this was not lost on anyone. Among the prisoners was a man named Karl, a mechanic from Hamburg who had served in North Africa. He kept a diary, writing in it whenever he could steal moments of privacy. The camp administrators would eventually confiscate this diary, storing it in files marked for examination, but his words survived. In one entry from mid-September, Karl wrote about the shoes with an honesty that must have cost him something. We laughed at them, he recorded, his handwriting cramped but legible. We called them farmer shoes and joked that only peasants would wear such things. But after a week of work, after days of walking in them, I must admit what I do not want to admit. They are better than what we had. Yesterday, I worked for 9 hours without sitting once. My feet, at the end of the day, felt merely tired, not destroyed. My friend Hans, who insisted on keeping his German boots, spent the evening soaking his bleeding heels in cold water and cursing. We do not laugh any more. We are silent, and that silence says more than any words could. The silence Karl described was indeed spreading through the camp like an infection. During breaks, when men gathered in the shade to drink water and rest, conversations that had once been filled with bravado now turned introspective. They began to compare experiences. Those who had served on the Eastern Front spoke of winters where proper footwear had become more valuable than ammunition. They remembered comrades who lost toes to frostbite, feet wrapped in rags stuffed into boots that cracked and split under ice. They remembered the desperate scramble for replacements, the way men would strip boots from frozen corpses because supply lines had failed, because the Reich, in all its proclaimed superiority, could not produce enough of the basic items soldiers needed to survive. These memories had always been there, but speaking of them had felt like disloyalty, like admitting weakness. Now, with American shoes on their feet demonstrating what was possible, the words came more easily. One veteran, a sergeant who had fought at Stalingrad, sat with his new shoes in his lap during an evening rest period. His voice was low but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "If we had these in Russia," he said, and then stopped, as if the thought was too large to complete. But everyone understood. If they had shoes like this during that frozen hell, how many men might still be alive? How many amputations could have been prevented? How many soldiers might have kept fighting instead of collapsing from feet so damaged they could no longer walk? The question hung in the air, accusatory and terrible, because the implication was clear. The Reich, for all its talk of caring for its soldiers, for all its propaganda about the German people being the master race, had failed to provide something as basic as adequate footwear, and men had died for that failure. Men had suffered beyond description for that failure. The paradox became impossible to ignore. This army of prisoners, men who had believed themselves the pinnacle of military excellence, were being undone not by lectures or punishment, but by something as mundane as a well-made shoe. Every step they took reinforced the lesson. Every hour of work that ended without foot pain drove the point deeper. The Americans, whom they had dismissed as unsophisticated and weak, had mastered the details that actually mattered in prolonged warfare. Not the grand gestures, not the spectacular displays, but the unglamorous logistics of keeping soldiers functional day after day, month after month, year after year. This was a kind of warfare the Germans had not fully understood, a war of endurance and industrial capacity rather than dramatic offensives and tactical brilliance. As weeks turned into months, the psychological impact deepened. The camp administrators, following established protocols, began organizing controlled tours for selected groups of prisoners. These tours were meant to demonstrate American industrial capacity, to drive home the futility of continued resistance, even as the war still raged across Europe and the Pacific. The prisoners, under heavy guard, were taken to factories, and what they saw there transformed their understanding even further. In Detroit, they stood on observation platforms overlooking the Ford River Rouge plant, and what they witnessed seemed impossible. Assembly lines that stretched further than the eye could easily follow. Machinery operating with a precision that made human workers seem like mere attendants to some vast mechanical intelligence. And the output, the sheer volume of production, was staggering. Not just vehicles and weapons, but everything an army needed, including shoes. A guide explained the process to them, his tone casual as if describing something perfectly ordinary. Every machine was calibrated to identical specifications. Every worker trained in methods designed for maximum efficiency. The result was standardization on a scale the Germans had never achieved. Thousands of pairs of shoes, each identical to the last, rolling off production lines every single day. One prisoner whispered to another, loud enough to be overheard. "This is not an army," he said. "This is a factory that happens to have rifles attached." The observation was meant as an insult, but it came out sounding like reluctant admiration. Because he was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, that was exactly the point. Maybe modern warfare was not about the romance of martial tradition, but about the cold mathematics of production and logistics. The contrast with German manufacturing became painfully obvious. Back home, or what they remembered as home before the war consumed everything, shoes had been made in small workshops by craftsmen who learned their trade over years of apprenticeship. Each pair was slightly different, constructed by hand according to traditional methods. This had always been presented as a virtue, as evidence of German quality and attention to detail. But quality meant nothing if you could not produce enough to meet demand. And as the war dragged on, as resources became scarce and factories were bombed and supply lines disrupted, that traditional approach had collapsed into inadequacy. Soldiers went without. Materials became inferior. Cardboard insoles replaced leather. Wooden heels substituted for rubber. The craftsmanship remained in theory, but the reality was soldiers marching in boots that fell apart. Meanwhile, America was producing more than 12 million pairs of military shoes annually. 12 million. The number was so large it seemed abstract, impossible to truly comprehend. But its effects were concrete. It meant that every American soldier, no matter where he was stationed, could expect to receive new shoes when needed. It meant that replacements were abundant enough that soldiers kept spare pairs. It meant that the unglamorous detail of footwear had been solved so thoroughly that it simply ceased to be a problem. This was the arsenal of democracy the Allied propaganda spoke of, but seeing it in person, understanding the scale of it, transformed the phrase from rhetoric into overwhelming reality. The prisoners overheard conversations among American workers that drove these points home with casual cruelty. A foreman mentioned keeping 2 pairs of army shoes in his closet at home because the government issued them faster than he wore them out. To the German POWs, this was almost incomprehensible. In Russia, soldiers had waited weeks for new boots while their feet froze. Here, the problem was not scarcity, but abundance. The difference spoke to something fundamental about the two societies, about their priorities and capabilities. One had focused on the appearance of strength, on dramatic gestures and symbolic victories. The other had focused on the substance of strength, on building systems that could sustain conflict over years rather than months. Back in the barracks after these tours, debates erupted. The officers, those who still clung to the old certainties, insisted that German discipline and fighting spirit remained superior. They argued that comfort was a distraction, that true soldiers endured hardship without complaint, that the focus on material goods was itself evidence of American weakness rather than strength. But the enlisted men, the ones actually wearing the shoes day after day, were less convinced. They had felt the difference in their own bodies. They knew that spirit alone did not prevent blisters, that willpower could not substitute for proper equipment. And some of them, in quiet moments, began to question what else they had been told that might be equally false. One such conversation, overheard by a guard and later recorded in camp reports, captured this tension perfectly. 2 young soldiers, both barely old enough to have fought in the early campaigns, sat on their bunks late at night discussing what they had seen. The first argued that the shoes proved nothing, that German soldiers had always been trained to overcome material shortages through superior morale. The second responded with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. But why should we have to overcome shortages at all? If our leaders truly cared about us, would they not ensure we had what we needed to fight effectively? The first soldier had no answer, and the silence that followed was the silence of foundations beginning to crack. These cracks widened as the months passed. Officers noticed that maintaining discipline was becoming harder. Not because the prisoners were rebellious in any overt way, but because their faith in the system that had sent them to war was eroding from within. The shoes had become a symbol of that erosion, a daily reminder that what they had been taught was incomplete at best, false at worst. Some officers wrote in their own diaries about this problem, about the challenge of keeping men loyal to an ideology when material reality kept contradicting its claims. One captain recorded his frustration after overhearing prisoners debate whether American democracy might actually be superior to German autocracy, using the shoes as their primary evidence. "They speak as if footwear is proof of political philosophy," he wrote. "As if the ability to mass-produce rubber soles somehow validates an entire system of government." And yet, he admitted in that same entry, he could not entirely refute the argument. His own feet, clad in the American shoes he had accepted for work duty, were more comfortable than they had been in years. The transformation reached a kind of culmination in the final months of 1944. By this point, the war in Europe was clearly turning against Germany. News filtered into the camps through various channels, official and unofficial, and the prisoners understood that defeat was approaching. In that context, the shoes took on additional meaning. They became evidence not just of American industrial capacity, but of the inevitability of the outcome. How could Germany hope to win a war against a nation that could solve the problem of footwear so completely, while also producing tanks, aircraft, ships, and everything else in quantities that dwarfed German output? The mathematics of it were overwhelming, undeniable, crushing in their implications. Some prisoners began to ask, tentatively at first, and then more openly, if they might be allowed to keep the shoes when the war ended. They were told no, that government property could not be distributed to foreign nationals, but the very fact they asked revealed how completely their attitudes had shifted. What had been mocked was now treasured. What had been dismissed was now valued above their own military traditions. It was a kind of surrender, not of arms, but of assumptions, and in some ways it was more profound than any battlefield defeat. The guards observed all of this with varying degrees of understanding. Some simply saw it as confirmation of American superiority, as proof that their way of life was better in every measurable sense. Others recognized something more nuanced, a glimpse into how victory in modern war required more than courage or tactical skill. It required the unglamorous work of logistics, the patient construction of systems that could sustain armies across years and continents. The shoes were just one small piece of that system, but they were the piece the prisoners could see and feel and experience directly. Through them, the larger truth became undeniable. When the war finally ended in May of 1945, the repatriation process began. Prisoners were sorted, documented, and prepared for return to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Many of them carried nothing but the clothes they wore. The American shoes remained in Texas, returned to supply depots, or distributed to new labor groups. But the memory of them travelled back across the Atlantic, lodged in minds, and reinforced by thousands of steps taken in comfort. In the decades that followed, when historians interviewed former prisoners about their experiences, the shoes came up again and again. Men who could have spoken of battles or captures or dramatic moments instead spoke of footwear, of the strange humiliation of realizing that their enemies had cared for them better than their own leaders had. A sergeant interviewed in the early 1960s put it bluntly. What defeated us was not American courage, though they had that. It was not their tactics, though those were effective. What defeated us was their ability to think about everything, even the smallest details, and to organize their entire nation to address those details. The shoes were just one example, but they were the example that taught me the lesson. When I wore them, I walked farther with less effort, and I thought, if they can make shoes this good, what else can they do? The answer, of course, was everything. Another former prisoner, a lance corporal who had served in France before Africa, wrote a memoir in the 1970s. One chapter focused entirely on his time in Texas, and a significant portion of that chapter discussed the shoes. He described the moment when he first put them on, expecting discomfort and finding instead a kind of revelation. He wrote about the slow death of his pride, the way each day of work eroded his certainty until nothing remained but acknowledgement. And he wrote about conversations with fellow prisoners who whispered the same forbidden thought over and over. If the Führer had given us shoes like these, if our factories had produced equipment this reliable, if our supply lines had been this efficient, would we have won? The question was unanswerable, of course, but asking it represented a kind of freedom, a breaking of the mental chains that propaganda had forged. The symbolism of the shoes extended beyond the individual prisoners. In the broader context of the war, they represented a fundamental difference in how the two societies approached conflict. Germany had treated war as an extension of national will, believing that superior ideology and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The emphasis was always on the dramatic, the spectacular, the gestures that would inspire and intimidate. Uniforms were designed to impress, parades were choreographed to perfection, weapons were engineered to be fearsome. But the mundane details, the logistics that actually sustained armies in the field, received less attention. When resources became scarce, soldiers were expected to endure, to sacrifice, to make do with less because their cause was righteous and their will was strong. America approached war differently, particularly once the initial shock of entry wore off and the full industrial might of the nation engaged. War became a problem to be solved through organization and production. The question was not how to inspire soldiers through grand gestures, but how to keep them fighting effectively over the long haul. This meant thinking about everything from nutrition to medical care to, yes, footwear. It meant building supply chains that could deliver material to front lines thousands of miles away. It meant creating manufacturing capacity that could produce not just weapons, but all the supporting equipment soldiers needed. The shoes were a perfect encapsulation of this philosophy because they were so unremarkable, so unglamorous, and yet so essential. Consider the mathematics involved. A soldier in the European theatre might march hundreds of miles in the course of a campaign. If his boots were heavy, that extra weight compounded over every step. 0.5 kilogram more per foot meant 1 kilogram total, carried over distances that stretched endlessly. That extra kilogram translated into energy expenditure, into fatigue that accumulated until men simply could not go on. American planners had calculated this. They had tested weights and materials and designs until they found the combination that maximized comfort and minimized fatigue. It was not exciting work. It received no medals or recognition. But it meant that American soldiers could march further and fight longer, and in the aggregate that advantage mattered more than almost anything else. The German prisoners, through the simple act of wearing better shoes, learned this lesson viscerally. They felt in their own bodies what proper planning meant, and many of them carried that lesson forward into the post-war period, into the reconstruction of Germany and the building of a new society. The men who had laughed at American shoes in 1943 became the men who, in the 1950s and 60s, helped build an industrial democracy that valued efficiency and logistics. Not all of them, of course. Some clung to the old beliefs, bitter and unrepentant. But enough changed that the collective memory shifted, that the narrative of German exceptionalism gave way to something more humble and realistic. The story of the shoes also reveals something about the nature of effective propaganda, or rather the limits of propaganda. For years, the German people had been told that their nation was superior in every way, that their soldiers were better trained, better equipped, better led, that their enemies were inferior, weak, corrupt. This narrative was reinforced through every channel, repeated until it seemed like objective truth rather than constructed fiction. But propaganda, no matter how pervasive, cannot override direct experience forever. When reality and narrative collide, reality tends to win eventually. The prisoners experienced that collision every time they laced up the American shoes. The comfort they felt contradicted years of indoctrination, and that contradiction could not be explained away. In the barracks at night, after the lights went out, men would lie on their bunks and process what they were experiencing. Some did this silently, turning thoughts over in their minds. Others whispered to trusted friends, testing ideas in quiet voices. A few wrote in hidden diaries or composed letters that would never be sent, but all of them, in their own ways, were grappling with the same fundamental question. If we were lied to about this, what else were we lied to about? The shoes became a wedge, splitting open assumptions and forcing examination of beliefs that had seemed unquestionable. This was perhaps the most profound victory the shoes represented, not a military triumph, but an ideological one. The human dimension of this story deserves emphasis because it would be easy to reduce it to statistics and strategies, to talk about industrial capacity, and forget that we are discussing actual men confronting actual doubt. These were not abstractions. These were young men, most of them, who had grown up in a society that told them they were destined for greatness, that their nation would dominate Europe and reshape the world. They had believed this, or at least most had believed it, because why would they not? The evidence seemed overwhelming. They had won stunning victories in Poland and France. They had seemed unstoppable. And then, gradually, things had gone wrong. Defeats accumulated, resources dwindled. The promised future never arrived. And now they sat in a camp in Texas, wearing enemy shoes that felt better than anything their own nation had given them. Imagine the emotional complexity of that position. Pride demands that you maintain faith in your cause, in your leaders, in the righteousness of your struggle. But your feet are comfortable for the first time in years, and that comfort is a gift from the enemy, not from the regime you served. How do you reconcile that? Some could not and retreated into denial or anger, but others let the experience open them to new possibilities, to the recognition that perhaps the world was more complicated than the propaganda had suggested. This opening was not always comfortable. Doubt rarely is. But it was necessary, a first step toward whatever understanding might follow. The guards and camp administrators, for their part, were not always aware of the depth of this psychological transformation. They saw prisoners who worked hard, who followed rules, who seemed generally compliant. They knew the shoes were popular, that prisoners requested them and cared for them, but they did not necessarily understand the symbolic weight those shoes carried. To American eyes, the shoes were just standard issue equipment, unremarkable and utilitarian. The idea that they could represent a kind of existential crisis for German prisoners would have seemed absurd if anyone had suggested it. And yet that is precisely what they represented. A crisis of faith triggered by something as mundane as proper arch support and cushioned soles. Historical documentation of this phenomenon exists in fragments scattered across archives, confiscated diaries, censored letters, interview transcripts from decades later. Reports filed by camp psychologists who noticed changes in prisoner attitudes without fully understanding the causes. Memoirs written by men who wanted to record their experiences before memory faded. None of these sources alone tells the complete story, but together they paint a picture of a profound shift in consciousness, a collective awakening to realities that had been hidden by ideology and propaganda. The shoes appear in nearly all of these sources, sometimes as a central focus, sometimes as a passing detail, but always as a marker of transformation. One particularly telling document is a letter written by a prisoner to his wife in late 1944. The letter was intercepted by camp censors and never delivered, filed away in boxes that were not opened by researchers until the 1980s. In it, the prisoner described his daily routine, the work he did, the food he ate, and then devoted 3 paragraphs to describing the American shoes. He wrote about how he had mocked them initially, how all the men had laughed. He wrote about the gradual change in attitude, the silent acknowledgement that they were wrong. And then he wrote this, a passage that captures the emotional core of the experience. When I wear these shoes, I feel ashamed, not because they are enemy equipment, but because they remind me of how badly we were equipped. How many of our comrades suffered needlessly because our leaders did not think about such things. How many men are dead tonight because they did not have shoes like these? I do not know how to carry this knowledge. It is too heavy. The shame he described was common among prisoners, though not all articulated it so clearly. It was shame not at having been defeated exactly, but at having been deceived. At having trusted leaders who sent them to war without ensuring they had what they needed to survive. This was a betrayal more profound than military loss, a violation of the implicit contract between a nation and its soldiers. And the shoes, by being so good, by taking such obvious care of the wearer's comfort and endurance, highlighted that betrayal in ways that could not be ignored. As the war drew to its conclusion and prisoners began to contemplate returning home, many wondered what they would find. Germany was being destroyed, cities bombed into rubble, the infrastructure of the state collapsing under Allied assault. They would return to a nation that needed rebuilding, to a society that would have to reckon with what it had done and what had been done to it. In that context, the lessons learned from American shoes took on additional significance. These men had seen firsthand how a society organized around democratic principles and industrial efficiency could outproduce and outlast a society organized around autocratic will and ideological fervor. They had experienced the results in the most direct way possible, through their own feet. Some of them, at least, would carry that knowledge home and use it to help build something different, something better. The post-war interviews conducted with former prisoners often returned to this theme. Men spoke of how their time in American camps had changed them, not through any deliberate re-education program, but through simple exposure to a different way of doing things. The shoes were one example among many, but they were the example most frequently cited because they were so tangible, so immediate in their impact. A former officer, speaking in the 1970s, put it this way: "We came to America as prisoners, expecting to be treated as the defeated enemy. Instead, we were given work and fair treatment and shoes that did not hurt our feet. This small kindness, this attention to comfort, it changed how we thought about everything. We realized that strength is not about making soldiers suffer. It is about making sure they can do their jobs effectively." The cinematic quality of the original scene, the image of German soldiers laughing at American shoes only to fall silent days later, has a timeless power because it captures a universal human experience, the moment when confidence meets reality and reality wins. We all carry assumptions about the world, beliefs about how things are or should be. And sometimes those beliefs are tested against actual experience, and we discover that what we thought was true is incomplete or wrong. How we respond to that discovery defines us. Do we deny it, clinging to comfortable falsehoods? Or do we accept it, even when acceptance is painful, and adjust our understanding accordingly? The German prisoners, by and large, chose acceptance. Not immediately, not without resistance, but eventually. The shoes gave them no choice because the evidence was literally beneath them with every step. And that acceptance opened pathways to new thinking, new possibilities, new futures. It did not erase the past, did not undo the war or resurrect the dead, but it created space for something different to emerge. In that sense, the shoes were not just better equipment. They were teachers, instructors in the hard lessons of humility and reality. The lasting image is one of those rows of shoes beside bunks, lined up neatly in the dim light of barracks evening. Each pair represents a small surrender, an admission that pride was insufficient, that belief could not substitute for facts. But each pair also represents a kind of hope, because implicit in that admission is the possibility of learning, of growth, of becoming something more than what propaganda had tried to make them. The prisoners who wore those shoes walked not just across Texas farmland, but across a threshold from one understanding of the world to another. Some crossed more fully than others. Some never crossed at all. But the threshold was there, marked by rubber and leather, offered by the very enemy they had been taught to despise. This is why the story endures, why it resonates across decades, why it continues to teach. Because it is not really about shoes at all. It is about the confrontation between ideology and reality, about the price of arrogance and the value of practical wisdom, about how the smallest details can contain the largest truths. The German prisoners learned what their leaders never seemed to grasp, that taking care of soldiers is not weakness but strength, that the unglamorous work of logistics and supply determines outcomes more surely than grand strategy or inspiring speeches. They learned this through their feet, through the simple experience of walking without pain, and that made the lesson impossible to forget. The story closes not with triumph or tragedy, but with the quiet aftermath of understanding, with men changed by something they never expected to change them, with the recognition that history's verdicts are delivered not only on battlefields, but in moments of individual realization, in the silence that follows laughter, in the careful lacing of shoes that no longer seem ridiculous but rather like gifts, like small mercies, like evidence of a truth too large to deny and too important to forget.